Okay, I think we will get going. Welcome everybody to the Wiener Holocaust Library. My name is Christine Schmidt, and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research here at the library. And we are really delighted to welcome you to tonight's first event that's part of our current exhibition, Genocidal Captivity, Retelling the Stories of Armenian and Yezidi Women. And this exhibition will be on show until May 31st. So if you don't get a chance to have a good look at it tonight, I hope you can come back and have a chance to see it. We are, of course, also pleased to welcome our audiences online too. And even if you can't visit the exhibition, we hope to give you a sense of what it looks like and what we've tried to do if you can't make it to London. So I will be in conversation with the main curator of the exhibition, Dr. Rebecca Jinks, whom I will introduce shortly. But first, just a bit of the boring housekeeping stuff that I always have to say before getting to the good stuff. We aren't expecting a fire drill. So in the unlikely event that you hear the alarm, we just ask you to leave the door in which you entered. The library only has one entry and one exit in case you haven't been here before, and just gather across the street at the gathering point. If you need the toilets, they are accessible in the basement. You just go to the back, you turn left out the store and go back to the lifts and take the lift to the basement. And after our conversation, we will have time to take questions from everyone here in the audience, but also online, and you can type your questions in the chat at any time. So we won't be unmuting anyone, but if you have a question, you can just put it in the chat. And so now to introduce the main curator of the exhibition, Dr. Rebecca Jinks is a historian of comparative genocide and humanitarianism at Royal Holloway, University of London. And together with the library, the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway forms the Holocaust and Genocide Research Partnership. And this exhibition and series of events these are activities that we collaborate on to provide access to the latest research on the Holocaust and genocide, and to consider how broader questions and concerns by different publics impact research. Becky is the author of Representing Genocide, the Holocaust as Paradigm, which examines the ways in which representations of the Holocaust have influenced how other genocides are understood and represented, focusing on the canonical cases of genocide, Armenia, Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda. Her current research project, Genocidal Captivity, is funded by the AHRC and explores the experiences of Armenian and Yezidi women genocide survivors in 1915 and 2014. So I also want to say that we are, of course, grateful to the AHRC, which funded this exhibition and a lot of our activities, our partners at the Armenian Institute and Free Yezidi Foundation, and our other supporters, including the Ernst Hecht Charitable Foundation, for their support of the work of the HGRP. So all of the introductory remarks are done. So I think maybe we should start with how this all began, how this project came about, why this exhibition is here at the library. As a lot of people know, our mission includes collecting, we are a library and archive. We collect about the Holocaust and other genocides. And often our exhibitions highlight our own collections, but in this case, we actually don't have a lot of primary source material about genocides other than the Holocaust. And this project that we collaborated on actually helps us to increase our holdings, because the oral histories that Becky is going to talk about that she conducted with Yezidi women will eventually be deposited here for research. And we also, of course, with this exhibition, took the opportunity to increase our publications, our printed publications on both of these genocides that are discussed here. And as I mentioned in the introduction, this is a part of the HGRP, the Holocaust and Genocide Research Project, which is this collaboration between the library and the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway. And this is actually the first HGRP exhibition that doesn't focus on the Holocaust, but it really dovetailed, I think, with your research, and we talked about this a few years ago. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you came up with just the idea for this research project and the exhibition.
Yeah, sure, of course. I mean, the project really arose out of the echoes between these two cases. So I started working on the Armenian genocide in 2011 and on women who were taken into genocidal captivity. And then 3 years later, ISIS invaded northern Sinjar, and the...
Now just hold your mic closer.
Yep, thank you. And So 3 years after I started working on the Armenian genocide, ISIS invades northern Sinjar, and the images and the stories that were coming out of northern Iraq just had such strong echoes. And that was partly in the genocidal process. So in both cases, mostly men were killed and women and children were either killed or taken into genocidal captivity. And then in the aftermath as well, both communities chose, in the cases of survivors who managed to escape captivity, they chose to leave aside very traditional, strong taboos about rape and about marriage outside of the communities and to reintegrate these women. But that reintegration, of course, was quite difficult. It was troubled. It was a very uncomfortable process. So that's another echo that I really wanted to explore. And there are also kind of less intellectual echoes. Good. This is a really iconic image from the Armenian genocide from 1915. Anyone who works on this will know it. In 2014, this one appeared. So there's no real kind of historical point that you can make out of this, but it gives you a kind of jolt of recognition, I think. So that's what I wanted to explore. The Swedish Armenian filmmaker who we have coming at the end of April to show her 2 films also, I think, was impacted by these 2 images. So anyway, I applied for an AHRC fellowship to explore these echoes, and as part of that, wanted to put an exhibition up.
When we think about different ways of disseminating research, I mean, obviously, a book project is one of the key ones that you would reach for. But why do you think an exhibition is a reasonable, a good way to disseminate this particular research?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, not everyone wants to read a book, right? They're different. I mean, the thing about the exhibition format, there are a few things. The first is, I think it forces you or allows you to rethink how you really want to tell a story. And so here, it meant that we could tell this story of genocidal captivity, not through a traditional historical narrative, but through 20 women's individual stories. And this is an image from the back half of the room. It's their stories which are foregrounded, not this kind of historical narrative. You couldn't do this quite the same way in a book. And I think it's really quite effective here. Likewise, one of the key messages that I wanted to get across is about how these stories are retold by journalists and by academics and by advocacy, humanitarians, whose stories get told and whose don't, what's emphasized and what isn't, what's marginalized. So no member of the general public is going to hunt out Human Rights Watch's report on the problems in the implementation of the Yezidi survivors law. You're just not, nor are you really going to come across my article when it's published. But here, in these 20 stories, we've deliberately included survivors whose stories are normally marginalized. You don't tend to hear them. And we show also what the real world effects of that marginalization actually is. And through retellings of these stories, the other thing we can do is to point out how they're written up and what's left out, what's emphasized. And I'm hoping, therefore, to prompt visitors to read news stories a little bit more critically, more knowingly, I suppose, in the future. So the exhibition kind of works at different levels in that respect. And the last thing, and perhaps this is obvious, but you can also present original documents and artifacts in full, even if it's reproductions as they are here. And what's good about that is, I think, that you can almost let visitors into the research process. They can choose to look at more or less of a document, to go back to things, to basically interact with the documents in a way that if it was a TV broadcast or a podcast or a book, you can't. So again, I think exhibitions are really good for this because they can be read at various levels and each visitor will get something different out of them.
Yeah, and actually, we're going to come back to discuss the specific design of the exhibition, but this is an exhibition that you're invited to actually touch. I mean, this isn't like a completely innovative design element, but that sort of tactile experience of research is something that we tried to mimic in the design, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then also just thinking about where public knowledge is held. You know, obviously, as you said, researching the survivor's law, nobody's going to kind of compare reports, but a lot of the kind of basic knowledge about what has happened comes from these, you know, at least in the more recent case, from these humanitarian reports. So in that sense, you're kind of trying to reach people where they are in terms of the knowledge that they have. So you know, it sort of works on that level as well. Another, I think, piece of this, and we can come back to this at the end, but do you think there's more work of this kind of exhibition to do beyond kind of public awareness? Is there a policy influence aspect to this exhibition's messages?
Yeah, I think exhibitions like this can become a kind of touchstone or focal point that can, you know, give momentum essentially to an advocacy campaign that's already going on, or maybe kickstart a new one. Certainly, I hope we can achieve something like that. So to give an example, there are quite a few parliamentary groups that are interested in the Yezidis, the Armenians, prevention of genocide, freedom of religion and belief. So I'm hoping they will come to see it and that can start a conversation at least. The UK Parliament has not recognised the Armenian genocide. Last year, it recognised the Yezidi genocide. But I mean, symbolic recognition is important to victim communities and their descendants, but it's also shouldn't be the end of it. I don't think the UK Parliament should consider itself absolved, especially since in the Yezidi case, this is still effectively an ongoing genocide because more than 2,000 Yezidis are still held in captivity. And there are so many issues around survivors' rights and their current living situation that need to change.
I think maybe at this point, it's probably good to turn to the content of the exhibition and to give people, especially at home, who may not have a chance to come and see it, a sense of what the content of the exhibition is and what we tried to portray. The back half of the room focuses on the Armenian stories, and in this section that we're sitting in has a focus on Yazidi women's stories. This is the kind of million-dollar question. How did you choose the stories we're talking about the Armenian section now. How did you choose these? I know it's very difficult because our space is actually not that big. It's not a big room. How did you make that decision?
It was a hard one. So some context, the Armenian women's stories that we have in that back section all come from the archives of the League of Nations, so the forerunner to the UN. Basically, in 1921, under a certain amount of pressure, they set up a commission to rescue Armenian women and children who were held in Arab or Turkish or Kurdish households. And one of the rescue homes that they set up was in Aleppo, and it was run by a Danish humanitarian called Karen Jeppe. This is her on the extreme left. Yeah, on the extreme left with some Armenians that she took in. And so for every Armenian that she rescued, she wrote their story in a really beautiful marble-bound book, along with their name and their age and their parents' names and their birthplace and the date that they came in. There's then usually a photograph of them that you can see in the corner there. And then there's a brief write-up of their story, maybe 200 words, a bit less. And on the back page, she tended to record when they left, what date they left the rescue home, and where they went to, whether it was to a relative that had been found, even in very extended family, or they'd become self-supporting, they were a tailor or a seamstress or whatever. So there are 1,563 of these stories. She took in about 1,880, but some of those stories weren't recorded, and one of the books has been lost. So 570 of those 1,563 were women or children or girls, women or girls in 1915. So 570 down to 10. That was fun. I tried spreadsheets. It was horrible and mechanical and a little bit like you know, a kind of humanitarian bureaucracy. In the end, I did what I felt and made this about capturing a range of experiences. That was the key thing. Not just 10 beautiful young girls. So you could do that. There are very beautiful photographs in this collection, But the stories that tended to come out into the news, and I think still ones that circulate, tend to be of younger girls who experienced extreme violence. But if you do that, it kind of ignores other stories of older women like Takuri, who was already 28 in 1915 and about 35 when she was rescued. Unfortunately, if I'm saying that she's older, then that makes me pretty old now, but there we go. AHRC was 5. She couldn't even remember her own name or birthplace. I also wanted to point to stories that presented the community with some quite difficult choices in the aftermath. So Lucia's mother gave her to a Turk so that she and the mother and their brother would be saved. Yegsa was taken in by an Arab family, and she was, like all of the other girls in the Arab tribe, was tattooed on her face and hands and body. And the last one, Sarah, when she was rescued, was pregnant. And so that faced the community with the issue of what to do with these children. Many of them were adopted out because it was just such an extreme taboo. I also wanted to show then how these women's experiences were represented in the fundraising literature. And maybe we'll talk about this a bit more later, but Yeppe used these stories, these 200 odd words, as like the basis for fundraising write-ups. And they're very much written, all of them with her objectives in mind, not what the survivors really said. It's not a faithful rendition in that respect. So that actually governed some of my choices because I needed to select women who had appeared in fundraising material. I needed something to put into the cases. But I also wanted to give visitors a sense of some of the kind of archival discovery processes that I'd had. So I think by the 10th Armenian woman's story, you kind of get that sense of repetition that I just alluded to, that Yeppe had favorite phrases or certain things that suited her to keep writing in there, partly for her fundraising goals. I think you can also, this is also about exhibitions, you can also give visitors a bit of a sense of the aha moment, the research epiphany, like that you get once in a while. But you've all got them here from me, courtesy of that. So this one here is, oh no, sorry, back one, there we go. The woman in the middle is Yeksa Hyderabadian. It took me about 6 years and 4 archives, each in a different country, to gather each of the images and physical artifacts that you can see just there. And the very last discovery was her name and her story. So I'd been unsettled by these images of this woman who was nameless and storyless for coming up to 6 years until the final thing when I actually worked out what her identity was. But as visitors, you get all of that in one go. I think that, also Mansoura, she arrived at the rescue home with her son. And at the bottom of her story, it says her young daughter is still living among the Arabs. And most of these stories you read, when someone like that is mentioned, they never find the brother, they never find the mother, they just disappear into the ether. But if, like me, you read through every story in every book in turn, you discover that actually 2 years and 471 people later, her daughter is rescued. So I can listen to you. So you can put that in a case and give visitors that sense of like, oh, wow, when you find those pieces of information.
And I think that sense of discovery is something we really wanted to try to, to kind of replicate in the exhibition. And you are encouraged to kind of touch the materials here in the back, and then in the front, you have to really kind of look to make those connections through the material that we've used, but we'll come back to that. So in this part of the room, you focus on a much more recent genocide of the Yazidis. And I guess I would ask you the same thing. How did you come to choose who to display?
In a way, this was harder because with these women, I'd traveled to Iraq to interview them. I'd sat opposite them as they trusted me with their stories. So for the 13 of 15 who agreed to let us use these stories in the exhibition, I had to get cut 3 out down to 10, and that was somehow harder. So this is just an image from in here so that people online can get a sense of what's in this half. I just want to say, in general, we're not sharing images of this side of the exhibition simply because some women don't want their stories and pictures to be shown on social media, mostly because a set of hate speech usually appears at the bottom of each article, and they find that very upsetting. And that's why we decided to make the whole exhibition kind of a no photography zone. So there's a lot of blurring going on. Again, with this case, most of the stories that have been told in the press are of younger women who have endured extreme sexual slavery. But the stories that I was hearing just didn't always fit that pattern. And it became apparent that, again, some stories were being marginalized and being excluded. So, for example, 4 of the women in this room, Hannah, Wahida, and 2 called Amira, have all been denied compensation under the government compensation scheme. It's called the Yezidi Survivors Law, because they find it difficult to prove that they were captive, or they were captive for not very long, or in one case, the authorities have decided that they converted to Islam of their own free will. So it's their own fault, scare quotes, that they were held in captivity for 3.5 years. So when I talk about the real world effects of the marginalization of some of these stories, I think that's what I'm talking about. They're denied compensation because they don't fit this story. But these women are also traumatized, and they also have physical and mental health problems. And the compensation that they ought to receive would make an absolutely massive material difference to their lives. There are a couple of other ways that, again, that I tried to capture this variety of experiences. So like with the Armenian section, there are some older women, some younger women, also one who became pregnant and whose child was taken from her and adopted. So, you know, as with the Armenian community, the Yezidi community really struggle with this extreme taboo of children fathered by perpetrators.
I mean, when we started to work on this together, just the process of reading the stories, the Armenian stories, and then also the Yazidi stories. I mean, everything that you said about having that immediacy and thinking about the real world impact also resonated with me, but then also made me, once we were thinking about this side, it made me reconsider that section as well. And so I wonder if you could comment a bit on that. So what you're hoping visitors will take away, and do you want them to kind of go back to the Armenian section and really think through, because obviously you authored, or generally we together in some respects authored this section. This is a more contemporary treatment, and how does that kind of subvert what's happening in the Armenian section?
Again, in a way, what I want is for visitors to have the same kind of research experience or research discovery that I had. So starting working on that one and then coming to this case study. As I said, the Armenian stories are incredibly formulaic. They're written not to capture the survivor's testimony, but in the words of the humanitarian. And in fact, we actually know almost nothing about the process by which those stories were taken. Some of the photographs that are included make clear that they were sent to the photographic studio in batches. You can see the shoulders repeated across those. That's a mother and a son and another woman who's completely unrelated to them. So were they also interviewed in batches? Did they give their testimony immediately on arrival, or was it after a few days or weeks? How much time did they get given to chat? Were they allowed to just talk, or were they asked questions? We don't know if the staff member wrote it down then and there, or later from memory. So there are lots of questions, and nothing really much in the archives to help us with that. One of the stories recorded over there, Valentin, records that she had a fit while she was giving her testimony. And that's the only record that we have to show of any emotion of any survivor, because the write-ups are kind of emotion-free. There's one fictionalized portrayal of the story in a fundraising film from 1926. And we can talk about this later perhaps, but In it, you can see two rescued women giving their stories, and there's a lot more kind of emotion and gesticulating than I can capture with the still. Again, emotion doesn't come across in the written stories. There's also one newsletter that we've reproduced in the back in original Danish language, in which Jeppe says, I'm sat at my desk here, I'm writing out lots of stories. And she comments how she finds it surprising that she can be so mechanical about it, and says, if you start to think about it too much, it would take your breath away. So that's a really interesting thing for a historian. She also says that survivors all have the same story to tell, which I kind of disagree with. She wasn't listening carefully enough, I think. But as I said, they end up on the page very formulaic. It's her words, not theirs. So we've tried to call attention to that process at various points. We've made some of the words on the stories in bold, and then added prompts on the side behind the tracing paper to ask visitors to start to think through it. The stories there, and in the blue on a slight angle are those prompts, just to ask people to start to question what's been written there. So in this Yezidi section, I knew that I wanted to echo what was going on there, but think about how in the 2020s, we might do this process of gathering survivor testimony and retelling it differently, slightly more ethically. So we started with roughly the same format, name, age, birthplace, photo, write-up of story. But we really then try to pull apart this presentation to make it look less authoritative, and to show some of the choices that I had to make, for example, in summarizing 6 hours of interview into 200 words. That was hard. So sometimes there's something like a note paper mock-up where I'm reflecting, like on the left there, reflecting on how hard it was to summarize, or on my recollection of someone's body language while they were giving their testimony. On the right there, you can see that we've included excerpts from the original testimony transcripts, just to open out what I've written there, to show more detail, to give a sense of what the survivor was saying. There are also bits where there's a conversation between the photojournalist Claire and myself about which photograph to use, what the impact of choosing different photographs on the visitor would be. We've also put an image of the room in which we did these interviews, just to remind visitors that these stories are made, they don't just appear. And finally, this thing I knew that I wanted to do before I went, I've taken a direct quote from each of the survivors, which either addresses the visitor directly or somehow tries to problematize the whole process, I think, of telling and retelling. And the example from that sticks with me the most is the one in the bottom right. It's Nazo. At the beginning of our interview, she indicated to us that she didn't want her photograph taken. And then partway through the interview, she's telling us a story of how there are sort of 500 of them being held in a school somewhere, and ISIS drag her off to a room, and she's nervous about what's about to happen. What they do is they take a photograph of her, and then they write her name down, and they put slave under it, and they put those things on an app to sell her as a slave. And I thought in that moment, oh goodness, like, isn't that exactly what Claire and I are about to do? We're taking her name, we're taking her photo, and we want to display them. And so at the end of the interview, I asked her, is that why you don't want your photograph taken? And she said, yeah, that's why, really. I mean, she fuddled around a bit, but that was why. So we've put the quote on her story, and behind the cartridge paper, I've replicated that piece so that visitors kind of get that sense of, oh, what's going on here, and my own reflections on it as well.
Well, can I, just to come back to what you said about the kind of ethical interview process, and that you mentioned wanting to take a more kind of consciously ethical approach to taking these interviews and conducting them, and photographing the women, as well. As you said, it's obviously very sensitive. So I wonder if you could discuss a little bit more the kinds of dialogues that you and Claire had, and how this fed into the approach of presenting the stories.
A lot of these techniques come from Holocaust studies and are now pretty widespread. So really doing these interviews involves offering to do an interview in a neutral space, a private one, away from where, for example, even male family members might be able to hear it. In this case, only having women present, so having a female photographer was important to me. Having a translator who speaks the woman's own dialect is important. Making sure that they know what the project is. I spent a long time showing them pictures of the library so they understood what I meant by the exhibition and who would be listening to it, who would be coming, they were interested in that. So talking through all of the issues and the questions that they had, so that they can make an informed decision about, do they want to have their faces shown? Do they want to have their full names? Do they want to choose a pseudonym? We also made sure that they knew they could skip questions they didn't want to answer, or just stop the interview if they wanted, and we did do that in a couple of cases. I also tried as far as possible to let them speak, not to ask lots and lots of questions, but to let them tell the story that they really wanted to tell.
And then I guess the follow-up question is, one of the main points of the exhibition is to think about who gets to speak for whom, and who speaks for survivors of genocide. So your approach obviously last year was very different from what was presented in the front. And I just wondered if you could elaborate a bit more on this main kind of question of the exhibition.
Mm-hmm. When I was first thinking about this, I did actually think about handing over all agency to the survivors, to basically ask them to produce self-representations, and others have done this. So they've handed out cameras and done some training sessions, and everyone's produced something. But practicalities, that takes a lot of budget and time, and that would make it a different kind of project. And it also, I think, for me, leaves unanswered this question of survivor stories being retold by others, by outsiders. So in the Armenian section, who gets to speak? Of course, not them, not with Yeppe. So we tried to quite clearly show then who did get to speak through these fundraising materials that we put in the cases. There were a number of English and Danish and German and French as well, groups or societies who helped Yeppe with her fundraising. It wasn't just the League of Nations. She produced stories and copy for them then to print and circulate. And this, like I said earlier, this spectacle of desirable young Christian women being forced into sexual slavery is obviously what opened the wallets of some Europeans at that time. So some of these women appear across multiple publications. Yep. You either get lurid, very sensationalist write-ups of their stories, or sometimes just images of them, like without even their names often. They're kind of converted into symbols. And so in this case, even though there wasn't an awful lot of space, we've managed to give those 5 women in this central picture, there we go, their names back, and to kind of conjure something of that moment. So of those 5 girls, some of them stayed there 18 months, but they actually overlapped only for 8 days. So you can sense in that moment that the fundraisers saw an opportunity to get a rather sensationalist photograph, and they sent them all down to the studio for that. In another case, we've put just one single image, which I think is quite impactful, which is the front cover of a rather sensationalist and thankfully short-lived British publication. So AHRC's story is not actually given anywhere in this issue of Slave Market News. She's just a kind of symbol of a rather respectable looking Christian girl who's been brutally violated. So in this Yezidi section, like I said, we've included quotes from the survivors, which hopefully just makes the visitor kind of stop and think what's going on here, in the way that they made me stop and think about consent and about what we're asking them to do. I'll put some more of those quotes up. 2 of them you've seen before in the top right and bottom left, but the other 2 are really about the ways in which survivors are asked to give and re-give their stories, often in very specific formats. So it's not just this question of who gets to tell, but how often they are forced to tell, really. And I think in this back section behind you, we've also included the kind of counterpart to the fundraising part, some contemporary advocacy reports. And we've included them because they use testimony in quite different ways. Some of them sort of fold it into their narrative, others make it bold and more obvious. Some anonymize their respondents, some give names and identifying information. So again, I mean, it's not to say that there's a right way of doing this. I don't think there is, but there are wrong ways of doing it. So that's what I'm hoping visitors will take from this. I think all of that sort of brings up this question of retelling explicit violence. And in the interviews, I made it very clear that survivors did not have to tell me intimate details, and that I didn't ask them to, in the way that journalists or legal teams in Kurdistan often do. I mean, do you want to talk through some of the choices that we made in terms of including that or not in this exhibition?
Yeah, I mean, we consciously decided that we weren't going to include graphic details of sexual violence or sexual slavery in the exhibition. You will find it in some of the fundraising material that's here back. And then what we tried to do was include content warnings. We've also included content warnings on some of the events that we're hosting as well. And I guess with that, we wanted to demonstrate that the experience is more than this. I mean, this is obviously part of the experience for many, but it's not only that, and other aspects of genocidal captivity need to also be represented and discussed. And some of this is related to age, which I think is well represented in both sections. And we also, I mean, in thinking about putting that kind of narrative on display, thinking if people can actually be moved without those kinds of details. And we'll be really interested. We have lots of feedback points in the exhibition. We have in the kiosk, there's a link to an online survey. We have the survey here. We have the visitor book. We have lots of ways. We're hoping to have a focus group during the exhibition. So we'd love to hear from people, their kind of reactions to the narratives. You can go away and think about it. We have also this pamphlet here that has more information that's free to take. And you can kind of digest it. And we would really love to hear how you've reacted to the way it's been presented and the kind of, sort of staying away from that kind of graphic description. But coming back to the exhibition itself, the kind of this format, we worked with a really fantastic designer who was able to put the concept into 3D. We discussed with him, his name's Mash Chudasama. He's really fantastic. And we had a really great time doing this with him. We think he did a terrific job. So let's talk about the design, the colors and the layering approach. And I just wonder if you could say a bit more about the choices that we made with MASH in terms of the design and how it conveys the central messages of the exhibition.
Yeah, it was really good working with Mash. He's got a very visual eye, so perfect for this exhibition. And he really took and he ran with the underlying concepts that we were trying to. I remember that first meeting and I was trying to articulate what I was getting at. And I think in some ways he really crystallized it for me. So layering, I think, is one of the things that he came out with. It was a brilliant idea and it completely vibed with that approach. So in the Armenian section, the women's photos and stories are printed on tracing paper. That was definitely his idea, not mine. And so he's then hung this tracing paper over standard exhibition panels. We partly did that for kind of legibility. The women's stories have been typed up and printed out so that people don't strain their eyes trying to read bad 1920s handwriting. And they're kind of held down by magnets. There are some interpretive texts behind that tracing paper. They're a tiny bit blurry, so you actually have to touch. And I think that symbolism of blurriness, of layering, of covering and uncovering and looking closer is, it's a research process, but it's really important for this exhibition particularly. The survivors' names, we also decided to print into Armenian, as they would have spoken it on the panel behind. Again, because of the tracing paper, it's sort of blurry. So these stories were written up in English, not a language I think almost any of them would have spoken. So to me, it was important to have some Armenian on the wall. The names are also spelt phonetically via a Danish ear. So some of the spellings are a bit dubious. And I had someone from the Armenian Institute, Gagik Stepan Sarkisian, helped me out with converting them into proper Armenian as opposed to English, Danish, Armenian. So on the panels also behind the tracing paper, we've reproduced the originals so people can get a sense of what the original marble-bound books would look like. But MASH then took the back pages of entries, not of the 10 women who were featured, and kind of papered the whole panel with these back pages. And that was a really nice idea because you get almost like a cacophony. The back pages are the ones, as I said, that record left our care, date, tailor, seamstress, living with her mother, something like that. So you get this kind of left our care, left our care, left our care. You see the destinations of these people, but but that's also reinforcing this point about it's what the humanitarians wanted. It's the project that they were interested in. In the Yezidi section, we've printed not onto tracing paper, but onto cartridge paper. I'm not sure if I put a slide up of this in the end. It's hard to photograph in this room. No. So the cartridge paper, which you can't see, has a really lovely texture. We've also got comments and the segments of testimony that I referred to earlier behind it. So you've got a symbolism less of these women's stories being slightly murky or blurry or hazy, but more a symbolism of you can lift this section, and if you listen and lift, you can understand an awful lot more. In terms of colours, usually exhibitions on dark topics have a dark colour palette. It's a kind of foreboding aesthetic, and it's done to make visitors feel uneasy. And we didn't really want to batter visitors with that. I think people feel uneasy enough with the topic as it is. And instead, picking lighter colours, so Masha was very happy with this, to pick these lighter colours, it allows you to think and to reflect a bit more, which is very much what we wanted visitors to be able to do. So as I said in that front section, he kind of papered the panels with the back pages of those humanitarian records. And in this section, he's blown up, now I am on the right slide, one of Claire's photographs. There was a sandstorm that day, so it's all kind of pretty hazy. And the kind of beigey browns also connect with a particular symbolism. I told you that Nazo didn't want to have her photo taken. So originally when I thought about her story, I thought, well, we'll just put up a black square so that everyone knows it's sort of not there. And then I decided to make it brown because brown is the Yezidi mourning color, and it's the color of dress that she and her sister have worn ever since they escaped captivity. And they're going to wear it until their sister comes out of Al-Hol camp. So it's the mourning colour. And this brown Mash is picked up in some of the other panels as well. A bit of a theme.
So let's talk a little bit about what didn't make it into the exhibition, the tent. Can we talk a little bit about that?
I'd like to talk about the tent because it's the only time it will appear. So I mentioned that exhibitions on dark topics tend to have a dark color palette. They also tend to use architecture these days. For the last few decades, architects have been involved in things like Holocaust museums to subtly influence how visitors respond to a topic. So the famous examples are Daniel Libeskind or the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They use very cramped spaces at certain points to make you feel constricted and constrained. Obviously, we couldn't do that here because I wasn't allowed to destroy a building. But there was a nice synergy in a way. Before I went, I was thinking this because the back half of this room is a very elegant Georgian building. And it's got some beautiful original Georgian features that I was hoping that we could sort of incorporate one way or another. Didn't quite happen because of the placement of the panels, but still. And then this back half, I thought, great, it's a bit more white wall, straight wall art exhibition that will vibe brilliantly with Claire's photographs. The ceilings are about 13 feet plus. So it's very light and airy back here. I thought that would work. And then doing these interviews, a lot of them were mentioning the tents. And Nazo mentioned at one point that she was actually quite nervous of being away from her tent. And that's because the electrics are crap. And frequently these tents catch fire. And in 2021, there had been a mass fire in a different camp. About 400 tents got burnt. So she was quite nervous about that. Then I started to look at what these tents, missed one. Oh, have we done that? Okay. Then I started to look into these tents, and their central parts are about 4 meters by 4 meters with a little vestibule at each end. This is the UNHCR family tent, which is supposed to do a family of 5 for a 1 year maximum. And that's what these people were given when they were first displaced into Kurdistan. And 9 years later, they were still living in them. Some of them, in fact, I can use that slide. Some of them have they've moved out of the camp, partly because for the first few years, they weren't even allowed to lay concrete underfoot. So in the winter, it was incredibly muddy. So some of them moved out of the camp and have made sort of informal structures. And now there is a kind of lot of extensions and things like that in a way. But this camp is what they were given. And the highest part of the ceiling is 2.2 meters, which is lower than a legal ceiling in the UK. So I wanted, in a way, to actually get a tent in here. It would just about fit into this part of the room, just to give visitors a sense of the constriction that these people are living in, but health and safety and practicality.
Do you want to say a little bit about the 3D maps? Because that was the other kind of way to give a sort of spatial understanding of what, and topographical understanding of what we're talking.
All right, now I am going to have to check that I'm on the right slide for this. Yeah, 3D maps, I think, are an interesting part of this. There are 2 here. One is the kind of relevant areas of the former Ottoman Empire, the parts that Armenians were deported through and to, which actually includes Sinjar Mountain, tiny bit in the corner, and one just of Sinjar Mountain, which is like a really towering presence in an otherwise very, very flat plain. And the idea came to me one evening in Duhok after we'd interviewed Amira. She had traveled just the night before ISIS invaded to Sinjar General Hospital from her village, quite some way away, because her infant was sick. And ISIS then invaded that night. The hospital was taken. She was separated from her husband, and she said, and he managed to escape and to run up the mountain. And I knew that Sinjar is right at the foothills of this incredibly sheer-faced mountain. But I thought, like, how did he get through town, you know, with ISIS all around? So then I Google Earthed it, as you do, and Sinjar Hospital's marked in red just there. Can see that actually the hospital is now right at the front here. The hospital is right at one of the access roads to get up the mountain. And this mountain is steep enough that basically you start getting up it, and it's hard for ISIS to either shell or to follow you because it's so sheer. So about 50,000 Yazidis found safety at the top of this mountain. For a short while, because it was August when ISIS invaded, and it's 50 degrees Celsius, and they hadn't taken a lot of water or food with them, so it was temporary safety. The US did some airdrops, and then they and the Kurdish militias made a humanitarian corridor. So some escaped that way. Some had gone partly up the mountain and then came back down to fetch provisions or medicine or something, and that happens. They would then be caught. That was the problem. That happened to Nazo and also to Hannah. Equally, where your village was really important. ISIS invaded from the south. Let's see if I can get this back up. Yeah, that'll do. ISIS invaded from the south. So the villages in the south had much less chance of getting away. Those north of the mountain, there's a link road that takes you to Kurdistan. So apart from the fact that ISIS had kind of blocked all of the telecommunications, some had already heard about it and were able to get to safety in Kurdistan. So geography was really important, and I wanted to kind of give that sense of experience with these maps. Likewise, with the Armenians, Turkey is not flat. they walked hundreds of miles and up and down mountains. And I wanted to sort of conjure that element also by placing that photograph that you can see, which is blown up here, where you've got a set of women. You can see that from the carts and things that they're carrying, it's too steep to get up, and they're probably going to have to unload now and carry their possessions with them on their backs up this hill. So I wanted to get that sense of mountainous terrain across that they had to walk through, and also to conjure the difference between the mountains that they'd grown up in and were farming and used to, and the very flat desert, arid plain of Syria that they were sent to.
Thanks for that. And also you completely impressed me with your ability to paint the 3D maps. So she's not only a historian, but an incredible artist as well.
I had some very good help.
I think probably at this point, I actually forgot to check the time. We probably should open the floor for other questions, but I think this kind of concludes our formal discussion about the exhibition, but we'd be really happy to take any questions. We also want to point out that there are many, many events coming up after this one. I think the next one is maybe next week. And then we've got film screenings. We have an archive discovery workshop we're doing with the Armenian Institute. So we have all sorts of activities planned, so you can check our website for other kinds of ways to engage with the exhibition and its themes. So without further ado, I'd like to open the floor up for questions. And then I'm also going to take questions from online too. And so if you have a question, just wait for my microphone, and then people at home can hear you too.
Thank you so much. Absolutely mind-blowing, just incredible. My question was related to Yepa, and was there any records of the women's, their actual voices and what they actually said? Is there any traces anywhere? Was it totally rewritten through her words?
For those who came to her, yeah. It's not surprising. They didn't have the same priorities that we do these days. The Armenian church did collect some stories, so there are caches of stories elsewhere, and there are plenty of Armenian testimonies if you look hard enough, especially in specialist libraries here at the Armenian Institute and in the US. What you tend to see is that stories of those held in genocidal captivity don't tend to be published and told as much, especially those of women. There are more written by men than women of genocidal captivity. And very, very often they actually come through the tellings of their daughters, granddaughters, subsequent generations, who are then recalling what their mother, grandmother was telling them at various points. And again, we kind of shouldn't be surprised by that. It's, as I said, reintegration was a troubled process, still is, I think, in some ways. And so it's a long reckoning.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
And lastly, sorry, just one last question. You mentioned, I think it was, about the women and the reality of being pregnant and the babies, and the babies were given away. How did those women feel about it? And were there any, honestly, there obviously were tensions between them and the communities, but how did that play out as well? Thank you.
Yep, straight in there with it. How did they feel? I don't know, right? I can't ask the Armenian women, I can only guess. And I was told before I went to Kurdistan, don't ask that question because they'll just clam up, which makes sense. So with the Armenian women, what I do know is sometimes they brought these children out with them. Sometimes those children are then listed as being adopted, or they've clearly been placed in an orphanage somewhere run by another Danish woman or the Americans, for example. But occasionally they are kind of integrated. But they were often called Turk children, Turk babies, or sometimes Armeno-Turkish, but never Armenian. So there was a kind of tension there. We also know that some women came out of captivity and then returned because they'd had to leave their children behind. So legally, these children were the property of their fathers. So that obviously creates all sorts of issues and questions for these women over whether they want to leave or not. And I think that is actually part of the process of genocidal captivity. That's why it's effective, and why it impacts grown women or women of childbearing age differently to children. In the Yazidi section, much the same problem. There's one woman here who did tell me of her own accord that yes, she'd had a child, and it had been, I don't think she really told me the process of how she came to be separated from this child, whether it was her decision or someone else's. But we do know that the community, it's still an extreme taboo for the Yazidi community. They're quite happy now to reintegrate the women, but the children are a real problem. And so often they're taken from the mothers, not necessarily with that mother's consent, and they're adopted out. And another problem is that some of those women then go to find their children. So these questions of identity and belonging and choiceless choices effectively still there. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. You mentioned that the UK Parliament still hasn't recognized the Armenian genocide. I believe it is because the Turkish regime is, since Kemal Atatürk, very friendly with the British government. Do you think if the Armenian genocide would have been done by an unfriendly authoritarian, for example, Russian or Chinese, would not be recognized on time, even 100 years ago? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yes, I think geopolitics plays a big role in this. It's politically difficult for the UK to recognize the genocide. It used to be a NATO kind of question, and now it's really seen as a question of the number of refugees that Turkey holds. However, that said, other Western nations and non-Western nations have recognized the Armenian genocide. So I think it raises quite an important question of if America can recognize it, then why not us?
Okay, and then we have one question from the online visitors, this from Anna. Often in interview-based studies, there is not only the question of taking someone's story to be displayed in distant context, but whether the researcher brings something back to the local communities in terms of knowledge and resources. Did you have discussions about how you contributed or can contribute in the future to the lives of Yazidi women?
Thank you, Anna. When I first started talking with Free Yazidi Foundation about going to Iraq, one of the questions that they asked me very, very carefully was, what are you going to tell these women? What can you give them? And I said, well, nothing actually, really. And they asked me that because a lot of journalists will promise them things, sometimes money, but often, if you tell me your story, X, Y, Z will happen. And I knew very well that I couldn't guarantee any sorts of parliamentary outcomes or funding outcomes from this. I'm a historian, not a lawyer or a humanitarian, so I was clear about that. That being said, some of the survivors I met are involved in something called the Survivors Voice Network. One of their members was interested in, what's this process of gathering testimony, and what's this, how do you make an exhibition? So one of the things I'm wondering about doing is going back to her and saying, can I find a bit more funding? Can I support you to do another project like this for yourselves? So if I can support that, then that would be great. That's how I'm planning to take this project forwards in the future.
Sorry for having many questions, but you also mentioned that Armenian people have been hidden or rescued by Turkish, Kurdish, and Arab households. And you have here listed Turkish before Kurdish and Arab households. But unfortunately, Turkish people still with all the Turkish authoritarian or regimes since Ottoman regimes up to now, I am talking, deny the Armenian genocide. Unfortunately, I haven't seen or heard much Turkish people that they accepted that genocide. Do you think that information you mentioned here, or you even listed Turkish household before Kurdish and Arab households, do you think that information does conform the reality with that information? Thank you. I don't think that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's my thoughts on the topic of Turkish people coming to understand their history mostly come through thinking about the fate of these women that are taken into households years and years later. So now, the descendants of these women are numerous, right? There are many so-called hidden Armenians living in Turkey. And in the last maybe 10, 15 years, quite a few books have been written where someone who thought they were Turkish have discovered an Armenian grandmother. And I think it's this very personal way of coming to the history that is going to start to change people's attitudes within Turkey. It's a bit like the kind of family history revolution that we had here or in the States in maybe the 70s, happening now in Turkey. I think that's probably going to be one of the more effective ways of changing people's minds. I think what I find with genocide is that when someone from a perpetrator community, or sometimes perpetrator and victim community, because they coexist sometimes, when they're very strong in their beliefs, there's not a lot I can say that will dislodge those beliefs. But for those who are uncertain or unsure or open, perhaps have never had the chance to talk about it with their family, perhaps something like this will change minds.
I like it. I don't think it's reality.
No, I mean, some people have their ideas, and yeah.
I like that, but I don't think it's reality.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to hear all the detail of how you made the exhibition, which is tremendous. It's really marvelous. Just one thing that struck me, what was the slave market review, or whatever it was called, and how come it was even published?
Yeah, it's I wish I knew more about it. I get this question a lot. The only copies that survive are 2 or 3 in the League of Nations archives and 2 in the Foreign Office archives here. So I said it was short-lived. It was part of the kind of abolitionist circulating. So they were interested mostly in white slavery. And in the early 20s, that mostly meant for them Armenians and some people in China. And the guy who ran it was in Sidmouth, of all places, but had connections with London and Oxford, and obviously was happy to fund YEPA. So I think it was running for maybe 6 years. That's the span that I've got. Irregular, and the write-ups are incredibly lurid. Yes, yeah, it is the most kind of dripping language of harems and, you know, sexual slavery in a kind of prim Victorian way, but also dripping with it. So it's strange. They also I mean, they sent these things to the League and to the Foreign Office to argue for intervention, for these women to be rescued. So the women who were tattooed was a particular interest of theirs. Again, I think because of the the jabbing that it takes to put the tattoos in, to them was sort of symbolic of rape in a way. They kind of mucked up because whenever they would publish a picture of a tattooed woman that I've got the original of from Yepa, they always drew on it to emphasize or overemphasize the tattoos. And in the Foreign Office, you get these notes from the Mandarins alongside saying, well, it's clearly just been drawn on. So they actually undid their own argument in a way. Yeah, it's a weird one. If you want, I can send you the copies.
We've got just a couple more here.
Yeah, so we have a few more online and then we're going to close up.
Have a chance to chat. And sorry, we're just going to have a couple more questions here and then we'll close it so that everybody has a chance to chat. Then you guys can chat a little bit more afterward. Okay, so if you want to read this.
So question from Katie. You've talked about content warnings and signposting to support the visitors. I'm interested in how you as a researcher take care of yourself when working with these stories.
Thank you, Katie. I have to say I'm kind of used to it by now. So there's a certain kind of closing off of the mind that you do in order to kind of read these things, to hear these stories. I have to say, when I was actually doing the oral interviews, so I've been listening to and working on oral history for 20 years. This was the first set of interviews I'd actually done. I was mostly concerned about listening and asking the correct questions more than but sometimes, of course, when you're sat next to someone and it's not just audio, it's a physical experience of being on a floor on a not particularly comfortable foam thing for 6 hours and watching someone physically display where violence happened to them on their body is quite affecting in some ways. But the researchers develop ways of being able to cope with doing these things. There's a kind of closing off, a kind of working through, a kind of working with the stories. And I think, perhaps unfortunately, but repetition tends to dull the senses. Ask me again when I'm writing the book and we'll see.
And then a final one, we got one from Barbara and one from Catherine that are quite similar, so we're going to link them together. What were some of the reasons you think that Yazidi women wanted to speak to you? Did they give insights into their individual motivation to be part of this project? And then how did they feel about this exhibition now, maybe?
Thank you. The way that we recruited, to use that term, Free Yazidi Foundation have contacts among survivors because they work with them as an advocacy organisation. So they invited many of them in. I think there's partly an expectation in the community, sometimes amongst men in the community, that these women should speak or will speak because of the kind of international, the more it's in the news, the more attention they get, the more they are likely to get aid or help, is the kind of theory anyway. So there's kind of an expectation. I think perhaps I was something different as well as a historian rather than a humanitarian or another lawyer or something like that. So there was a kind of interest in the fact that these stories were to be archived. So that, I think, I've forgotten the second part, Esmond. Do I keep in touch with them now, effectively?
Yeah, and what do you think about the exhibition now?
Those who I am in touch with, Free Yazidi Foundation are telling them, about all of the events and so on, but obviously most of the stuff's in English. Those who I'm in touch with are really happy about it. They know that there are events going on. I've sent some pictures of themselves as they've been represented, and they've been just kind of supportive and happy, really, that this is happening. I try to stay out of their WhatsApps with topics like this, because I think, while you're busy doing whatever you're doing on a Tuesday morning, they don't need to be reminded that I'm telling their stories all of the time. But when they do kind of come back to me, that they're always, very happy. I mean, I don't know why in some ways they're so generous with their time, but they're always very pleased that I'm doing this and hopeful that lots of people will come and see it.
That's a great place to close. wanted to thank you for willing to answer all my questions. And of course, thank you to all of you for all of your questions and also online. I'm hoping to give you just a little bit of time now to look at the exhibition if you have a chance. And also if you want to ask other questions to Becky that you didn't get a chance to ask her, you have an opportunity to do so. So wanted to thank you all again for coming. And thank you, Becky, for the exhibition.
Thank you, Christine.